afternoon, Lone Star Drift audience. We're here at Drift Week 6 with Wout and Dion. Wout is from Amsterdam, Dion is from South Africa, and I'm from America. And we were going to talk about the cultural differences between different regions of the world's drifting. And also, since we're not actually from those regions, we're going to talk about why the Japanese style of judging and the Japanese style of driving and everything is different than Drift Masters, where they do very line-based, not style-based or all these different things. And in Japan, they would have a very different style and judging versus something in Drift Masters or America or Grassroots First Pro, and how all that stuff collided and why it did. But then I was we talk about that stuff so much. I thought it'd be more fun to talk about Wout's experience within Formula D this year, which kind of puts Dion out he's just sitting here now, but he could chat about stuff. Say hi.
Hello.
Perfect. And Wout, you have your own mic. Flip it up.
Oh, flip it up?
Wout, tell me all about your experiences in FD, what you learned. Actually, you guys are pretty familiar with him. Wout has a lot of ingrained opinions, you could say. Before you go into your ingrained opinions, tell me what you actually learned. Not just things that reinforced what you already know, if that makes sense.
Right.
But what did you actually learn? Because I learn stuff all the time from everybody around me. I love learning. Tell me. And of course, Drift Week has the best sponsors such as BC Racing Custom Coilovers, Vape Tasia, Heatwave Visual, NK Wheels, WhatMonstersDo.com. Use the discount code EBISU. And of course, ECU Master for building the James Dean car and coming on this trip with us. Thank you, everyone.
So I think what we learned is that there's not a lot of time before you have to qualify. You don't get an endless amount of laps. And there's, I kind of almost expected that. They run it pretty well. It's not the easiest thing to do, obviously. It's much more difficult to run than people think. But you get between 10 and 15 laps before you have to qualify. And we showed up with a new team, a new car, also a car that not many people run. There's only 3 Corvettes in Formula Drift. There's only 1 in Pro Spec. So we're the only one on a 255 GT radial tire with a Corvette. And we had never been to any of those tracks. Utah, for instance, nobody had ever been there because there's a new track on the roster. And that makes it kind of difficult because you need a couple laps to dial in the car. So we look at what gear ratio do we want to run. And you can do a lot of stuff on the simulator, finding out what gear ratio you want to run, which wheel speeds you want to run. But then you can only be 90% correct. There's also things you're hey, this gear ratio seems really good, but let's try another one. Maybe we'll be able to get to that clip better, or we'll preserve the tires better. So that's definitely one of those things that you have only, let's say you have 12 laps, right? Then you have 6 laps to dial in the car from scratch, and then the driver has 6 laps to get completely in the groove and get into his best shape once the car is great. Because if the car isn't great, the guy's not going to have his best runs, not going to have a good qualifying run. So that's one thing that I learned, that you need to, almost every change you make to the car, almost every click you change in the damping, tire pressure, all that stuff needs to be correct. As soon as you go in the wrong direction, there's not a lot of time to set it up correctly. And yeah, that's definitely a thing, a big lesson for us, because now we already have all the data from the tracks, and if we show up in 2023, we'll already show up with the car set up probably 95% correct.
But you've been around pro drifting in Europe or things like that, Drift Masters. You already knew that stuff, didn't you? What is something you knew, or something new, something that wasn't just I feel that's just baby steps there.
Yeah,
you should have known that.
One thing that surprised me is how little you see other people during the events. So everybody's really busy. There's obviously a lot more sponsoring going on in America than in Europe, right? So there's a lot more activation going on. There's a lot more people visiting, sponsors visiting. And we even had a politician visit in Orlando. And it's way more professionalized in that way. So European drivers are great, but there's just way less drifting economy, right? So the sponsoring, all that stuff is probably 10% of what it is in America. If you look at guys like Dylan Hughes, he is so active with sponsoring and activating stuff and doing all these things, and that's you don't see those guys because they're always kind of busy during the events. I think I spoke to Chelsea once in the whole season, right? Because he's busy. He has obviously his RTR, he has his own vlog, he has BC Racing. He has all that that stuff, and it's very, very hot. So most of the time, those guys are going to be in a trailer. So I was like kind of like surprised because there's a bunch of guys that I obviously know from Drift Week, right? Like Ben Hobson. I'm like, man, it's going to be so cool. We're going to be hanging out all the time. But the fact of the matter is, everybody is so busy that you don't hang out with anybody. You're just with your own team all the time. Yeah, and apart from that, it was kind of like how I expected it to be. I think one thing I'll say for Formula Drift that gets that's like a big misconception is that people are not at the drivers' briefings, right? So I did my very first Formula Drift drivers briefing in Orlando. And Ryan Lantain said, if you guys have any questions also about events that already happened, about the judging, you can ask them right now. It was the first event of 2022. And somebody asked, all right, so at Road Atlanta, Chelsea lost to Brendan Sorensen, and everybody, I don't know if you know anything about that, but everybody's like, that's not true, that's incorrect, and Chelsea should have gotten a battle. And somebody asked that in a driver's briefing, and then Ryan and the other judges explained it, and I was like, yeah, this actually makes sense. And that's one thing that people don't really understand. There's stuff that they specifically say in driver's briefings that makes sense if you overlay that with the judging calls, but they don't broadcast the driver's briefings. So you know the decel zones, you know the general idea of what you have to do, but like it's really little things. There's going to be parts where they're saying like, oh, you can have your brake lights on, but we don't want to see you decelerate a lot. Mm-hmm. And that's a big thing, right? So I did a competition event in Germany in August, and I asked the judges, so the decel zone, right? How does that work? Do you not want to see me brake at all? Because I can go deeper and harder if I left foot brake most of the track. And they're like, no, every time you touch the brakes, it's deduction. And Simon Olsen was also doing that event, and he specifically asked, so do you mean the brake lights coming on, or do you mean slowing down the car? Because he obviously took that away from FD, because he also has FD. And the judges said, no, every time your brake lights come on, it's going to be a deduction. So I do my qualifying, I don't touch the brake at all. But I'm not as deep as I can be, I'm not making as much smoke as I can, because it's a small track, right? So, and then I get a certain score, and I see the guys that score 95, their brake light is on the entire run. Mm-hmm. The entire run. And those are things that people don't really get. Like in FD, I was surprised. That's one thing I was really surprised about. The judges tell you exactly where you need to improve, and they'll tell you, let your spotter come up to us and say like, hey, my driver, Aaron Losey, is gonna drive now. Would you guys pay attention to him and tell me what he's doing right and what he's doing wrong in practice? And I think that's a really good thing. And I think people are almost making it out like it's the big bad FD judges or the big bad judges of any competition, it can be clutch kickers, whatever, against the drivers. But what really surprised me in FD is that they're on the side of the driver. So they're like, we want to watch you do a really good run. And they're way more helpful and way more approachable and way more like, hey, you know what I'm saying? Like DJ or spotter could go up to the judges and say, hey, this is my driver's run. What do you guys think? Where can he improve? And I think that's a really good thing, because that's like, they help make the show better. They're not there to they're not working against you. Mm-hmm. So I think that's pretty good. And that really surprised me positively, because obviously I'd never been in an FD driver's briefing, and I see all the posts on Facebook like, that's bullshit and that guy got robbed, and it's like, you know, the big sponsor drivers are winning again. We had Travis Reeder winning in New Jersey, and Rome almost won in New Jersey. So Rome had a technical problem, and the car made it back on track. If he would have not made it back on track, he would have won the battle, because he was not deemed at fault. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really believe in these big conspiracies. People like, yeah, Asbo always has to win, or Forsberg always has to win. I really don't believe in that, especially now that I've been there myself. So I think it's way more, they love drifting way more than it would seem, right? The judges, at least. I obviously don't know much about the rest, but I was like surprised about that, because you know how people always make it out like FD doesn't really care about drifting. It's just business, it's just money, they don't care. I didn't really get that experience, but that's just speaking for me, right? So yeah, that's how I feel about it. I had a really good experience.
That's everything you learned?
Yeah, I think so. The rest is all technicalities.
I like the technical stuff more about the cars, than the judging or anything else. I think judging is always subjective. Judging is what it is. It's like a necessary evil in our sport, and it changes and it ebbs and it flows and it varies in quality and like the amount of effort, or I guess the amount of competency a person brings into judging. But like, how do you say? Like, even watching Assetto Nerds over the years, those guys have gotten so good and so crazy good, not because of the judging or this or that, but because of the way they love to drive and they set up cars and like the passion behind it. I think that's what's great about drifting. I think that judging, as someone that has even just recently judged a ton, and I always judge a ton, the judging is just like a necessary evil, and it's not very interesting other than like the drama and the dramatic part.
Well, like there's obviously comp drifting and there's fun drifting, and so Drift Week is like great.
Wait. What I was asking about was, what did you learn during Formula D? I'm going to keep harping on the same things because I know you probably have some great things. What did you learn technically about the cars and stuff? You know what I mean? Don't you find that more interesting than the judging, or more interesting than some of those things? Because like we all know you get 10 laps. We all know that judging is suspect. We all know that the judging might be suspect, but the fact that it's probably done very competently and behind closed doors and stuff.
Yeah.
What about the cars?
It's like little details. So the Corvettes have a lot of forward bites. So your mission in life when you're running a Corvette is make that car drift. Because Corvettes don't really want to drift, right? They want to go straight. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand.
I think Corvettes drift amazing and they love to slide.
Exactly, that's what most people think. But for a competitive advantage over an S chassis or over an E36 or an E46, because this is, I say 2022 is the year of the E chassis, right? So you see Adam LZ dominating clutch kickers, absolutely dominating clutch kickers. We had Andy Haitley winning with a brand new E46 in Orlando. We have Travis Reeder, we have Dylan Hughes winning Pro 1 in Orlando in the rain. We have Rome doing really well with what's probably the cheapest car on the FD Pro 1 grid is Rome's car. So I think the E-chassis is now coming to a certain maturity in America, that there's more and more people making like big builds and like learning the ropes that you already knew with S chassis earlier, because America's always been about S chassis a lot.
No, I mean, we had Michael Essa winning an E chassis.
That's true, but he was like so in Europe, obviously there's way more BMWs than there are Nissans in any competition. So in America, obviously it all started with S chassis and stuff because it was so much leaning on the Japanese drifting. Mm-hmm. So I think that's like the E-chassis, the E36, E46, it's kind of weird to call it E-chassis because an E90 and an E53 is also an E-chassis. So let's say an E36, E46. That's probably right now the best chassis in drifting, even better than a Corvette, if you look at the entire package. If you look at details, the Corvette is actually more suitable for FD because it's more rigid. So it's a sports car from the factory. It's developed about 7-8 years later than the E46 was developed. It has huge frame rails. You don't need to stitch weld anything. You just put a cage in it for safety, but the chassis doesn't need any performance enhancement. Where an S chassis needs to be stitch welded, an E36 absolutely needs to be stitch welded. E46, you don't necessarily have to stitch weld it, but you need to, to get the performance out of it that a Corvette has, you need to build it in a European way, like connect the cage to all the pickup points of the suspension and the strut tops and stuff. You can't do that in FD. So I'm like, yeah, so the Corvette is probably the more rigid chassis, but the E36 probably is like 5% better for drifting. So that's kind of our challenge. So we're looking at what the E36, E46 can do, which I know because that's like, it's been my bread and butter for a long time. And we're kind of like on that. So I think that the E36, E46 has much more side bite than a Corvette. And a Corvette.
Get back on track or out of here.
Right? Are we done?
No, we're. I have a question as a drift casual.
Right.
How much do you think sometimes, because like these professional drift programs have turned into such a big thing that relies heavily on data and like being able to change like diff ratios and all this stuff, like how much of inconsistency for drivers, especially with how little they get to practice, do you think is like, at what point do you have like diminishing returns of like changing too many things in the setup like constantly, as opposed to just keeping the car almost the exact same?
That's a really good question.
Just learning to drive.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The thing is that in FD, so in Pro spec, we run the same tire, right? And that tire, that like limits what you can do, because the Corvette can take a way, way bigger tire than a 255 GT Radial. The thing is, like, I always say that, like, if you want to, let's talk about Pro 1 for a minute, right? You need to have a car that's not nice to drive. You're not going to win in a nice, easy car. You're not going to win in a grassroots car on steroids. You need to wind the car up so far that it's almost undrivable. So that's the thing. It needs to be, of course you can win and you can probably qualify with a car that's not set up great if you're a really good driver, if you're Chelsea, if you're James, if you're Ryan Turk. It's just that you'll probably lose the battle because right now we have such a great level of driving, not just in America, but also if you look at the Drift Masters event in Poland, it's incredible. There's also nobodies that are coming up that are giving Jack Shanahan, that are giving Adam Zalewski a hard time, right? So the level of driving, and maybe also because of Assetto and all those things, and also because the Facebook pages and all that stuff, it's really, I feel like it's growing exponentially. So people now know this transmission doesn't work. That angle kit is not good. That angle kit is good. You know, so it's kind of like trickling down to, I wouldn't say a spec series, but people now kind of know, right, how important it is to have a quick change. And I agree, you could have the wrong gear ratio and you could qualify great. But if you look at Drift Masters qualifying scores, FD qualifying scores, how high you have to qualify, you can't leave anything on the table anymore, right? Especially if you go to a track you've never been. We've seen James Dean driving here. He's obviously the best driver in the world, so nobody's gonna, you know, argue with that. But he has a little spin in the first turn. He needs to get accustomed to the car. He's also human, right? So that's interesting to see him drive on this layout with the rest of us, basically.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. So if James Dean's car has some kind of malfunction, it has 60 horsepower less, or it has the wrong gear ratio, or it has the wrong sway bar setting, these days he could get beat by a Travis Reeder or by a Matt Field, you know, not taking anything away from Travis Reeder or Matt Field, but you know what I'm saying? So it's trickling down to the little differences where I believe that, for instance, 5 to 10 years ago, if your car was not completely dialed, but you would need 30 laps, right?
So you basically have to risk potentially being uncomfortable in the car to try and extract every last bit of performance. Because if you don't do that, you kind of guarantee that you won't be competitive.
Yeah, so the thing is that you need to set up cars in a way that the difference between on and off throttle grip is not enjoyable anymore. So certain cars will only work on full throttle. As soon as you start lifting the throttle and the car is floating and stuff, it becomes almost impossible to have a good chase. And I think that that's like becoming more and more clear that there's no way anymore to cut corners or to be like, hey, that driver is 10% better. So Chelsea is obviously a very, very good driver that drives completely on feeling. He's 100% driving with the rear axle. He's 100% all in. Even if he has like a safe run where he's on an advantage, he's killing it, right? And I think that's what you need to do, right? Not just as a driver to get a high qualifying or to win a battle, but also for the crowd. So we need to attract these crowds, and they need to see dramatic drifting and fast drifting. If you see Drift FD or DMAC in real life, it's so much cooler than on the live stream.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what we really need to be looking for. And what's interesting to me is how far will it go, right? So we're basically, so some of us have kids that are drifting now, right? Aaron Spiegel's daughter is drifting. I feel that we are basically like the first generation of drifters, and the generation that comes under us, they're coming up now. Luke Fink has his kids with him. They're probably going to be drifting. I see them on all kinds of dirt bikes the whole time. So Hurt from Hoonigan, he has a kid. Those guys are very likely going to end up drifting.
In Teslas.
How good will they be? Well, probably not in Teslas. But how good will they be? How far can we still go, right? Or are we going to go back? Or is it going to get outlawed? But let's say it's not going to get outlawed. Let's say it stays the way it is. How good is the next generation going to be? You guys ever think about that?
I'm kind of the opinion that drifting will probably end with this generation. So I'm kind of just like trying to make the most of it for myself in the way that I do drifting. Because I kind of don't think, sorry, Fielding just drove by with his body kit.
What's Fielding doing?
Dragging.
It sounded like broken glass.
It sounded like glass in Fielding's bumper, but right.
But anyway, yeah, I don't know. I don't really think about that because I don't think drifting is sustainable in that way.
Well, I totally agree with that, and that's my fear.
Yeah, I mean,
But
it's not-
I
it's
try
not
to
a
be
pod-
positive about it. I think that at one point, so the whole direction that we're going to right now with, you know, being anti-cars and all that stuff.
Before you go down that path, I was going to say,
Let's just do one sentence about it, and then we're not going to touch upon it again.
touch about what?
About how risky it is that drifting could end with us, because we
Oh,
don't
no,
want to do the whole
I
topic.
wasn't going to talk about that.
Okay, cool.
I mean, I was going to talk about that, but not the way that you were thinking.
Right,
I was
okay,
just
cool.
going to say, I was actually maybe the way you originally asked it. I think our children's generation, like one more generation, I think that not talking about the cultural or economic or government things, the level of what you can do in a drift car probably at some point is pretty close to being tapped out. Maybe we've been there 90%. Maybe the cars could go faster. Maybe they could be more angle. Maybe they could do things. But you're only adding slightly on top of things. We're not going to be like monster trucks where we're doing backflips and we're doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But none of that is important. If our kids could just enjoy the amount of pure joy, like you had a crap Miata that was awful. And every modification you made to it was terrible, but it was a fun learning process and you were having fun ghettoing this Miata up and you had a cheap car and it was within your budget and you could do it. If we could all have that experience of like the pure happiness of just modifying cars and doing goofy things and being with friends and like all that, I think that's what really matters. And I'm not gonna say whether that's gonna end or not, but I was gonna say that matters more than the ultimate potential of what a drift car could do. Because take NASCAR or something like that. NASCAR's never gone faster than like the 70s or 80s because it got too crazy. Like all they do is make small differences in things. Probably sprint cars is, you know, similar. I think that we've probably tapped out a lot in motorsports and all we have to do is be entertain ourselves, get ourselves excited. Because drifting, just like any motorsport, is for people that love hard work and hate money. So it depends if you're willing to work hard and you're willing to like go down the journey of learning to be a mechanic and touching cars and taking things apart and, you know, playing fake engineer and doing all these things. So I was gonna say, I just think if our children's generation is going to have fun with this, that's all they need to accomplish. And I don't think drifting has that much of headroom to do backflips and corkscrews and wheelies and everything else. That's all. Here you go. Keep going. Actually, you should answer the next question is yours.
I don't think I have another question.
Yeah, you do. You have lots of cool thoughts. Ask Wout something. Have you ever seen a Wout video?
Yeah.
Then ask him something. You've had to have had wacky thoughts. I love
I
it.
kind of like I default to quite a negative kind of outlook on things, and I'm trying to not do that in a video.
Oh, you can do that. Aaron's
'Cause for
always
me, it's
trying
like
to do
I
that.
feel like, oh, it's doom and gloom, but it's comical, so it's like I just, you know, whatever. But
Yeah. Well, it is a little doom
don't
and
know.
gloom, but
I've got something for you. Look at the way that pro drifting is like slightly influencing drift cars. Look over at my car right now. It's got big tires in the back, little tires up front, you know, height-wise, which looks kind of comical. Looks more race car in the back. Now those 265s or whatever that are up front or 245s look rubber band small, don't they? Is it interesting to see like pro drifting slowly trickle down? But I'm doing it not for grip, but for like tire life. You saw my tire life this week and I'm still in the first set. It's crazy, isn't it? What do you think about like the differences in just Texas drifting and like my car over the years as we're moving forward in time?
I think kind of like what you were saying, I think like within competitive drifting, we're getting to this point now where the cars are like almost as good as they can get for that format and for the type of tracks and the country you're in terms of like resources and all that stuff. And I think that every grassroots series, whether it be, I haven't been to Poland, but I watch the videos, and whether it be South Africa, Japan, or here, the cars are kind of all getting to this point where they make the most sense for what they are, for where they are, kind of thing. So like a Texas drift car, I've been coming to Texas events for 6 or 7 years, and 350Zs and that kind of thing have kind of just become the like de facto, like this type of seat time car where it's like, sorry, there's a 350Z right there off camera. It's like, you know, bucket seat, basic angle, coilovers, lock diff or a two-way or whatever, 265s for tire life, all that kind of stuff. That makes sense in America, but that would probably be, I think it's changing now, but that would have been like a really expensive setup in Japan up until recently. And there, like at Ibisu, for example, JZXs have made the most sense because in terms of economy and reliability and all this kind of stuff. And so then, you know, as a development of the sort of 350Z idea, I guess something like a basic LS swapped S chassis on 265s, like your sort of C-Type car. That is kind of the perfect cookie cutter, have fun in tandem in America at grassroots style events setup. Like you could probably do with a bit more power, but to compromise entire life and like reliability is probably not worth it. And I think it looks cool. I think we've kind of like, when I got into drifting like 8 years ago, like on the style side of things, all of us had cars that were like slammed to the ground and they were terrible, and like we couldn't really learn how to drift very quickly, and we didn't understand why, because the cars were bad. And then I guess because of Naoki and like a bunch of people, we started like considering raising our cars. And now I feel like there's like a, drifting is very much still a style thing in America, and obviously in certain scenes more than others, but even in like these types of grassroots events, we do care about what our cars look like, but ultimately they have to be really functional, and this is kind of like most cars here at that sort of perfect like height and tire to body ratio and all that kind of stuff to have like a functional good fitment for a grassroots car.
I think it's interesting how it's like an evolution, right? So if an animal is in a different environment, it evolves differently. And that's the same with drifting. Like it's very funny that drifting is obviously all about fun. So FD is something, but like drifting started out as guys just having fun, right? You're just driving in the mountains and you're having fun with a rear-wheel drive car, because there were a lot of cheap rear-wheel drive cars in Japan. All these 80s and early 90s Japanese cars were rear-wheel drive, and there's this guys starting to do it. And now it evolves in something in America because people are starting to do it, people are starting to come watch it, and then you let it boil for 20 years and it becomes FD, right? But the nice thing is, like, all that stuff starts to exist right next to each other. So there's still guys like us. This is very much close to how drifting started, like almost a standard car with like a handbrake and some simple bolt-on things. So what I really like about drifting is that these extra levels or these evolutions, they exist along with the start, right? So if an animal evolves, it changes, but the version it came from does not survive. And in drifting, it's like the grassroots simple stuff with simple cheap cars remains. Oh yeah.
There's a Corvette going by with steam just pouring out the hood. Keep going.
It almost looks like smoke, but I don't want to say
But
it.
I think that's very, if you look at...
I feel like I should be doing something, but keep going, guys.
You want to go there?
Is that steam?
No.
That feels like, that looks like smoke.
It looks like smoke, but keep going.
Yeah.
If you go to Walla Walla, we went to Villains, right? Mm-hmm. And all those guys had really cool S chassis with sick wheels, and they were all slammed, but they had 5.3s in them. So that's like really interesting to me. So that's like the style of cars that you could never do an FD event with, because the tires are stretched, it's slammed, but they're like, yeah, we're in America. It's like an SR is maybe harder to find. Let's put a 5.3 in it or whatever. And I think that's really interesting. And it's also individualism. Drifting is about expressing yourself, almost like art. And in America, people just express themselves differently than they do in Europe and than they do in Japan. I think that's really interesting. I think it's kind of weird when people are saying like, hey, a drift car should be like this, or it should be like this. Like, no, a drift car is whatever you want it to be and whatever it is to you. And my oldest car that I still have is an E36, my competition car before. I had the black E46. And that car is the worst car I have. It was a super bad chassis to start with. We put a cage in it overnight, so I qualified for an event at some point years ago. And the organizer said, hey, you made it to the battles, but your car doesn't have a cage, so you can't battle tomorrow. So we put the car in the trailer, drove back to the shop, put a cage in it overnight, and went back to the event. But that cage is obviously not great.
Yeah.
Right? So that whole car is not great, because it's an evolution of me screwing around with it. And it was I am the 27th owner of that car. It's an E36 325 that had 27th owner.
Oh.
So it's not a great car, but it is me. It's me more than like the last car I built for myself, the 4-door E46 sedan. I feel like my old shitty E36 is more me.
Yeah.
And if you look at it's like a 50-footer. Like from 50 foot, it looks cool. It has cool wheels. It's way more stance than my other cars. It has big lips on the wheels. It's cool. It looks cooler than my pro car. And it's more me, right? Because it's all those years, all those little things. It's not fast, it doesn't perform great.
Yeah.
But I think that's like that car is you, right? I see you, I see the car, I think of you. If that car,
I didn't build that car, have anything to do with
No,
that
but
car.
you know
I
what I'm
traded
saying.
for it, which is the more errant
if you
thing.
would sell that
I put
car,
RPF ones on it.
If you would sell the car to Fielding, it would be weird seeing him drive that car. If you would drive Fielding's car, it would be, if you guys would sell your cars, that car
So
is so much you.
this is actually a topic for another video I just thought up in my head. We should whiteboard out how drift cars become in existence, such as you cosplay because you see something, so you copy and build something. You're building a competition car for a certain region, you build something. You build a seat time car, that's regional, a 350Z for America, a JZX there. And we could just throw out like where the origin of every drift car is. That'd be a funny video.
For the drift cars
Especially
here, you
'cause,
mean?
like, no, just for like in general, you could throw them out. You could throw them out here for here as well, but mostly here it's like drift week style things. Most of the cars have been raised to a certain level, have angle, have top, you know, like everything's on a very similar setup. You don't have dudes here on stretch 15s. You don't have dudes here on 215s on a 9-inch wheel even. Like everybody's on a 265, you know, everything is the exact same thing.
Right.
All right, I think we've covered enough. Is there anything you want to say?
No, it's great to be in America again. I always really enjoy you guys commenting on these videos. I love doing them. As you know, it's all 100% unscripted. We literally walk around. Aaron comes up like, hey, we're doing a video. I really wanted to talk about...
They really depend on the quality of the questions I ask.
Yeah.
So I have to sometimes, by the way, guys, do 5 videos with Wout, and then we get 2 bangers normally.
Yeah.
And then we get 1 or 2 that are just like, meh.
Yeah. But
the banger ones are really good.
I wanted to do what we initially thought about, like the cultural difference between Japanese, what we just talked about over there, like with the Japanese.
Well, we need to go get a couple extra people, like an Australian and some others. We'll get Luke and, you know what I mean? Like, we need some characters. I didn't feel so confident about doing that video, but we'll do that video next.
I also think we need a bit of time because we've had that conversation off camera, like very recently. It's okay. And so
we need to relax and chill on
I
it.
feel like we need to forget the things we've said and then like.
You don't know how we make these videos. I'll bang out 5 hours of these things.
He has no idea how we do video.
Dude, I'll just line these people up.
I wish I had what you want.
I've been in a sweaty trailer in Atlanta with Hurt for like 2 hours, just fucking. Yeah.
I'm gonna go ask Luke what rules that he and other people have made that have ruined drifting and how to roll them back, like that 235 rule.
But Luke made a rule for.
Yeah, you can only have 235s, and I'm like, cars need big tires to distribute the heat and have enough rubber and do all these things. But they're from the land of $40 tires, and we're not. So that's a regional difference. We have to make our tires last because they're freaking $150 in America right now. Yes. All right, we're done. Boom. And don't forget, you can join us for public days on Drift Week 6. Grand Sports Speedway, we're allowing spectators and extra drivers because it is round 6 of Lone Star Drift. So if you want to come ride with the drivers in their drift cars, meet them, have fun, just check out the cars, come have some fun.